Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for today's panel on surveillance reform, transparency, and accountability, which has been co-organized by the Global Network Initiative and the Center for Democracy and Technology. Obviously, communication surveillance has been a major topic of conversation and debate at internet governance and policy conferences like this one over the past year. As Richard Allen noted in yesterday's Business and Human Rights panel, for many of us, the scope and extent of intelligence surveillance has not precisely been a surprise, as many civil liberties and human rights advocates have been warning for years about the potential breadth of many of the authorizing statutes. But in the past 11 months since the first Snowden disclosure, the debate around communication surveillance has taken on a much higher profile. Around the world, we see more media coverage, more public awareness, more activity in legislatures and courts, all seeming to reflect the sentiment that this surveillance has operated under the radar for too long. One of the biggest stumbling blocks to the full, informed, robust public debate that we as members of democratic societies must have about the nature and scope of surveillance is a lack of information about what current law is and how it's being applied in practice. So today we've assembled a distinguished panel to help us dig into the topic of transparency. And to kick us off, I'd like to ask Cynthia Wong, who's the senior researcher on internet and human rights for Human Rights Watch, to talk to us a little bit about the relationship between transparency and human rights. Why is this such an important issue?
Sure.
Sorry, I was stuck in the other pedal.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Welcome.
This might be a little off the cuff, so I hope that's okay. We're with Human Rights Watch, and so we've been engaging on the surveillance issues in pretty deep ways since the Snowden disclosures began. And one of our main requests to both governments and companies is greater transparency. But I think to frame the discussion, we need to first ask, what is the actual objective behind transparency? Because depending on what the answer is, that then informs what we're actually asking for, right? And just some initial thoughts on why transparency is important. First, I think it's really important for an informed public debate. So if we don't actually know what kind of surveillance is happening, what the scope is and the scale is, and who it's actually impacting, then we really can't have any kind of meaningful public debate. And we can't really say whether what is being done in our name and in the name of our security is truly justified and is something that we want as citizens and members of democratic societies. And I would also note that clarity of law and precision of law in terms of what surveillance practices are occurring is also required by the Human Rights Framework as well, which has been reiterated many times in the past year, particularly by Mr. Frank LaRue, the UN Special Rapporteur's report in June of last year on surveillance issues. And I think especially with the Snowden disclosures, what we've really learned is that the average person out there, the average internet user, not the experts in this room, really didn't have a good idea of the true scale and the level of invasiveness that digital surveillance now allows. And so I think that's one of the reasons why there has been this demand for greater transparency among a broader set of people. So that's the first, I think, objective really, is to make sure that we can have a true public debate and to make sure that governments are complying with their human rights obligations to be very clear and to regulate surveillance in law. I think the second reason really is accountability. And this does tie to the first objective as well. And it's accountability by two different actors. For governments, it's really to make sure that governments are complying with their own law in the way that surveillance is regulated, and to ensure that even though there must be some level of secrecy when it comes to national security issues and criminal law enforcement, there is some way to make sure that governments are within the law and can be held accountable by the public. But for companies as well, I think what the Snowden disclosures really showed is that if their users and customers can't trust that companies are pushing back against mass surveillance, are pushing back against illegal surveillance requests, then they're going to lose trust in those companies and may want to switch, right? And so I think it's both holding companies accountable for how they're respecting our rights as internet users, and for the company's own benefit to be able to demonstrate that they are actually taking their human rights responsibilities seriously. And I think especially not just with the countries that have been discussed most of all this past year, but all around the world, companies are the subjects of increasing numbers of requests for user information, requests for assistance with surveillance. We've seen this in a number of the company transparency reports that have been put out in the past few years, and those numbers are only increasing. And so I think it's imperative that companies be very transparent about how they're responding to those requests, and really show that if they are getting illegal requests, they are acting in the interest of their users and pushing back against them where they can. And so I think accountability is a really key part of transparency as well, to make sure that governments are accountable to their public, and to make sure that companies can be held accountable for their actions in facilitating surveillance abuses as well. So those are the main points that I had.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. And I thought we could turn now to Mr. Lionel Veer, who's the Human Rights Ambassador for the Netherlands, to provide your perspective on sort of framing this discussion of transparency and accountability and the links with human rights.
Thank you. Sorry for being late. I think we all try to push very important long discussions into little time. So that's, I think maybe the chance of repeating because I missed some at the start. I think the Italian recommendations, there was one on surveillance, but I think basically is very good. It speaks about clearly defined powers must be necessary, proportionate, interest, a legitimate aim. Decisions should be taken by a competent authority and should be subject to meaningful oversight. So states should be as transparent as possible how they carry out. I think these principles, I think this is what the Dutch government tries to live up to. But of course, we also are sort of in the process of implementing these ideas. For us, privacy, the right to privacy is a fundamental right. And I think in the Dutch society, there is the government is, we set up a mechanism by which we try to implement this and to see for more transparency. We send reports to the parliament. We have a parliamentary committee which looks into these things. And I think we are working on new legislation where we try to improve this. But at the same time, we sort of concluded that surveillance is necessary. I think the citizens also expect the government to provide a certain level of security and the prevention of crimes, not only for terrorists, but for all kinds of things for which criminals could misuse the internet. So I think with the need to improve your tactics on the internet to prevent crime, you also need to step up your means for accountability. But I think these are issues that we can discuss in more detail, but what I would like to raise maybe as something that pointed out that there's also a struggle within governments, of course. Like I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm the Human Rights Ambassador. So you would expect me to emphasize the human rights in this debate. But I can assure you, when we do this in the Netherlands, talking to the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of the Interior, we also have a battle, because they are thinking they have different responsibilities, different priorities. Of course, they are not saying we're going to not respect human rights, but they are working from a different perspective. So I think it's a good thing that in the Dutch system, we all work together on these issues and debate among ourselves. But on top of that, I think it's important that the government can do so much, the legislator can do so much, but in the end, you need also good journalists to look into it. You need good, responsible citizens to look into it. And you need civil society like Human Rights Watch and others who look into it. And I think in a way you have to, maybe strange as a government official to say that, but you have to mistrust your government in this sense. I think when you have surveillance techniques and you have technicians and people who are, say, controlling the buttons, why do they do it? Because they can. And in a way, it's the obligation of the politicians, the responsible politicians, to set the standards. But of course, along the way, things will go wrong. And you need, say, society in the wider context to look into it. That's why I think, apart from what you can do with legislation and accountability, et cetera, but you need to also make sure that you have, you stimulate, you sort of push your societies to look at you in a critical way. And I think that's one of the basics of democratic control in this sense. I leave it to you.
Thank you. And on that topic of civil society organizations pushing and asking for more information and trying to hold governments accountable, I'd like to turn to Susan Morgan, who's the executive director of the Global Network Initiative. Susan, I know that in the fall, the GNI actually sent letters to the member governments of the Freedom Online Coalition asking for information about their surveillance practices. Can you describe a little bit the responses to that and sort of your thoughts on how that plays into this wider debate?
Sure, thanks. In September last year, we wrote to the 21 governments at that time in the Freedom Online Coalition, and we were really asking for two things. We were asking for the governments to consider greater transparency around their own surveillance practices, and then we were also asking for them to consider whether they would enable companies to be able to be more transparent about what they were being asked to do. We wrote to, in the 21 countries, we wrote to the equivalents of the Foreign Secretary, Department of Justice and the Home Office. And we've had now probably either sort of direct engagement or written responses from about half the governments in the Freedom Online Coalition. The responses have come from a variety of places in the government, so I think this speaks to Lionel's point. So we've had, sometimes we've had letters from the Foreign Affairs Department, sometimes it's been the Ministry of Security and Justice. So there's been sort of a number of different sort of approaches in the letters. And I think, to be honest, the responses that we've had so far have been mixed. I think some of the letters have done a very good job in terms of outlining where current statistics on government requests are already available. Some letters haven't directly addressed the issue of greater government transparency, but have talked more generally about the issues and sort of activities that they're undertaking through the Freedom Online Coalition. And a few have addressed specifically the issue that we raised around enabling companies to be more transparent. And we're now sort of in the process of working out what our next steps are and, our next sort of engagement with the Freedom Online Coalition. I think probably just like to say a couple of things, echoing what Cynthia said about the importance of transparency. So thinking back to the principles and guidelines that GNI has created for companies, within the implementation guidelines in there's actually a specific sections on the importance of communication with users. And I think it's important, for companies to be able to be transparent with their users for two reasons. I think there's a general reason, which is about the need to sort of educate users and enable them to be informed about the issues and laws and practices and things that are being used. And I think there's also a specific thing around, companies being able, whenever possible, to be specific with users if they've actually been impacted by a particular request, if that's possible. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Dirk Brengelmann, who's the Commissioner for International Cyber Policy of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and to ask for your perspective from the government's perspective. Do you perceive gaps in transparency reporting and the information that's available publicly about the law around surveillance? And do you think there are justifiable limits on transparency?
Thank you very much. Let me first say I thought that yesterday evening, I don't know exactly his name anymore, but there was in the Big Tent meeting somebody from Estonia who also spoke about transparency and the need for transparency. I found that interesting. Like my Dutch colleague would like to say that I think the Tallinn recommendations are good work in this regard. Also, I know that somewhere in civic society, I'm looking at Anja Kovac, who was in Sao Paulo, didn't think that Sao Paulo was a full success. I would at least argue that it was some success. And in terms of the transparency back home, we were one of those who received German Brooks. We had a discussion with him. I offered him a platform to meet with people from different ministries and give him some insight in the reporting system. I think one of the issues which came up for debate, and here I have the same experience as my Dutch colleague, was the issue of reporting by companies. I think our Ministry of the Interior thinks that they are the ones who should report to the public about what they have asked companies. Companies make the point that they should have more freedom themselves. As we are in that limelight, so to say, of discussions between various political factors in the system, in our country, one of the biggest debates traditionally has been on what is referred to, I think in English, as bulk collection. In German we call it Vorratsdatenspeicherung. This has been the hot issue of debate in Germany over the last years. The previous government was not able to agree on it. The new government had some agreement on it, but then that fell flat basically because, as you know, the European Court of Justice, I think is what it is called, made its recent ruling. So I think we're back to square one on this.
Thank you. On the topic of the role of companies in all of this, I'd like to turn to Chris Riley, who's a senior policy engineer with Mozilla. I know that Mozilla has been very involved in several campaigns in the US on surveillance reform. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the role of companies in advocating for greater transparency and more general reform.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think the best place to start is the trust theme. I think that's a really a good focus and lens for this debate. So part of what Mozilla and others, sort of particularly technology companies, can do is direct advocacy, right? We're our impacted and trust on the internet has generally been harmed by the revelations of aggressive surveillance practices. It's something that we feel very, very proximately for the reasons that have been discussed. So Mozilla was an early leader in Stop Watching Us. We've been a significant part of the We Need to Know coalition, which has a number of different civil society groups on it in particular. So part of what we do, I think, is direct advocacy and campaigns to the U.S. government to try to get both more direct disclosure from them about surveillance practices and also more freedom for companies in the technology industry to report more data in their transparency reports. And that's, of course, a very active area of discussion. But I want to broaden it a little bit beyond that as well, because I think there's some other angles to this that get into this trust theme that come from different kinds of surveillance practices. So I tend to think of surveillance practices and the threats that we've been seeing and the risks and the harm to trust over the past year in three buckets. One is sort of a mass surveillance bucket, a bulk collection, as was put aptly. So direct taps on data, gathering of data as it flows along the wire would fall into this category. A second category is where we normally talk about transparency in this context, and I think of this as surveillance by proxy, right? A government request for information to a private sector company who has already collected it, right? To a telco or to a tech company, often with a great degree of secrecy around it. And this is the core of sort of our traditional conversations about transparency reporting. My biggest interest in this space, and an area where I think we need a lot more conversation and a lot more public debate, to get back to Cynthia's point, is around targeted surveillance and the practices that are done to make targeted surveillance more effective. So I'm thinking about weakened encryption standards. I'm thinking about secret efforts to try to get backdoors into security and communications tools, and stockpiling of zero-day vulnerabilities and things in this space. And I'm not going to say that this is a rampant problem or that these things are happening all the time. That's not my role, and I don't even think that's true. But I think to a degree, there's a lot happening in this space, and we're not talking about it enough, right? And that is a kind of transparency where I think the public interest community has a role, the private sector has a big role, and governments have a big role. The theme of one of the talks I gave at this year's RightsCon I was on a panel that Access organized called the Crypto Wars 2.0. And I was reading about the Crypto Wars 1.0 in the early 90s, where we were having a big public policy debate about whether to allow high-bit encryption for greater security. And we won that debate. And I say we won that debate in the sense that we got policy to allow larger key lengths for encryption than could be brute forced at the time. And the reason we won that debate was because we had it in the open, was because we could have a really serious, direct conversation about what was at stake, about why law enforcement was concerned about secure encryption that they couldn't read. And I'm really worried that we're not having the conversation about security vulnerabilities and standards and the processes that are going into that debate. I'm worried we're not having that conversation enough. or enough out in the open. And that is the really proximate thing that I worry about when we get to the idea of trust and how users do or don't, and the damage to trust that directly affects American technology business interests, I think.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go now to Nick Pickles, who's the director of Big Brother Watch. So Nick, your organization has been heavily involved in the surveillance debate in the UK, including bringing a case against the GCHQ in the European Court of Human Rights. But I know yesterday at the Big Tent you were commenting that there's not as much as we've heard about sort of the debate going on in the US, there's less of that in the UK. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that and maybe, you know, why do you think that is, and what do you see that needs to happen to change that?
Yeah, and I've spent so many months trying to explain to people why the UK isn't having the same kind of full-throated debate that we've seen in the US, and I've kind of come down to a conclusion of James Bond, and something to do with the fact that I think, you know, Britain's never had a revolution, it's never had a Watergate, it's never had the kind of situation that would, you know, even the most fervently libertarian right-wing prime minister would never begin a speech with the words that the president used, which is that the American people should never fully trust their government. No. So the idea that a British prime minister would say something like that is beyond comprehension. So the British public are generally trusting of the state. And I think this lies at the heart of the transparency debate. You can give people lots of information, but it might not necessarily be very informative. And I think that's one of the real dangers we have now is governments publish lots of statistics, but the danger is that the statistics don't give you a real picture. So in the UK, we've just had, for the first time ever, a breakdown of the use of surveillance powers by intelligence agencies. We used to just have one figure for the whole country. Now, last year, we had a debate about a new piece of legislation to go further on data retention for internet companies. And our intelligence committee said, no, all that information is too sensitive. We can't tell the public what percentage of these surveillance powers are being used by the intelligence agencies, and they redacted it. 9 months later, that same information was public, and there was no security damage whatsoever. So one of the big problems that transparency reports don't necessarily address is a culture of secrecy in governments. And I think that's the heart of our challenge in the European Court, is this idea that, as Cynthia said, you can have a law that says something, but if the law itself is so vague that the discretion that the interpretation allows then means that citizens can't reasonably understand when they themselves might be under surveillance because of the activity that they've pursued. So the nature of our case is based on two basic principles. Number one, that what's been exposed is a disproportionate intrusion onto the right to privacy. And the second point is that the quality of law is so weak that citizens can't understand it. And so far, the British government hasn't taken steps to remedy either of those issues.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn now to Anya Kovacs, who's the director of the Internet Democracy Project in India. And to kind of complicate this conversation a little bit, I'd like your perspective on what the situation is in India and how relevant are these conversations about transparency to the kind of issues that you are facing?
Thanks, Emma. Just on the Net Mundial, we do also see that there are a lot of good things. Well, no, it's important to say, but I think what the meeting did was throw up a lot of tensions, and the Brazilian government has to be commended for actually putting into place a process that allowed that. So a lot of the value will depend on what we do next, I think. But on the topic of the event, actually, a lot of the comments Nick makes really resonate with us as well. In a more general way, I think what is interesting, coming from a country where the transparency debate on the internet is actually not that strong, I find it really interesting how governments increasingly use being transparent as, I feel, almost a justification for their surveillance practices. So nowadays, sometimes when I hear government officials, it's almost as if they publish the statistics, it's kind of fine. If you know what is going on, then it's okay. And I think that's one thing, Cynthia made it very clear in her opening remarks as well, that that is not a road we should go down to, and I think it's really important we continue to push back on that. Having said that, I can see the importance of transparency. In India, we basically have none on government surveillance. There are a lot of the surveillance happens without companies being involved. So having corporate transparency reports is useful to an extent, but we know from journalists, etc., that the transparency reports don't reflect all requests in any case. But apart from that, most of the surveillance doesn't happen through telcos anymore. There is an initiative called NatGrid, which links 21 databases in the country. 11 intelligence agencies have access to that data, and it doesn't have the kind of securities built in that we heard from the Estonian president yesterday. There is surveillance at the international gateways where they can do searches on keywords, etc. There is the central monitoring system, which basically allows all real-time communication to be monitored and data to be stored. None of this, I mean, there are cases in which warrants are issued by the courts, but that's not a necessity, so most of the demands are purely from the executive itself. And I think what makes the situation really complex is the fact that we don't have, the right to privacy is not explicitly included in the Indian constitution. It's written to the right to liberty. And there is no horizontal privacy law either, which means that in general, protections for the right of privacy are fairly weak and secondary to other rights. And on top of that, the intelligence agencies do not have any parliamentary oversight. So all the oversight of the intelligence agencies is purely executive as well. It's Home Ministry and the Prime Minister. So it creates a situation where the whole surveillance landscape is extremely opaque. And even recently, we know that the government issued a new set of standard operating procedures, which was supposed to put into place more safeguards. But even those operating procedures have not been made public. So if we get hold of these documents, it's always through leaks. So even at a very basic level, it's really difficult to get more detailed information. Most of the struggle in India has ended up being about actually trying to get privacy protections into the law, rather than looking at trying to get more data. I think it's further complicated by the fact that national security is very much a holy grail. It's really difficult to touch. If you ask too many questions, you get pushed back very quickly. If you are an NGO that has funds from outside of the country, there is immediately comments about the foreign hand being involved in the debate, etc. And these are really sensitive issues. So I think for us at the moment, it's been privacy that has been the focus, though I can clearly see that India would benefit from greater transparency on these issues.
Well, thank you all. I think I'll take the privilege of asking the first question. So I just wanted to remind all of us that in the recommendations that the Freedom Online Coalition governments signed on to here in Tallinn, one of the paragraphs has the governments dedicating themselves in conducting their own activities to respect their human rights obligations, as well as the principles of rule of law, legitimate purpose, non-arbitrariness, effective oversight, and transparency, and call upon others to do the same. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how do the different stakeholders work together to help realize this commitment to transparency that the Freedom Online Coalition governments have made? How do we respond to Nick's point of not having just information, but actually something that's informative? How do we respond to the struggle that Lionel and Susan noted of the different parts of government being potentially very disconnected in these conversations? Anyone in particular would like to jump in, or we could just go to Susan, please.
I think just to add, I think there's also a second part of the recommendations from the Freedom Online Coalition that are relevant to this debate, which is I think there's a commitment to greater transparency on government processes. I don't think it doesn't specifically say surveillance practices, but certainly from a GNI perspective, we're hoping that will include surveillance practices.
I think it's been raised a few times, and I think it's becoming more of an issue, is looking at the way that offline surveillance interferes with online issues. So whether that is an undercover officer deliberately placing malware onto a computer, which may monitor someone's use of the internet, but may be considered a traditional human intelligence source rather than an online surveillance. And I think, so we've been doing some work in the UK to try and look at how many of those operations are being mounted with zero success. Whereas we might have the number of requests made to telcos about subscriber information, we have no idea of how this crossover is happening. And I think that's something which, on the one hand, it might not seem obvious that the Freedom Online Coalition should be looking at offline surveillance, but I think it's important to have a full picture for citizens. And that means looking at whether it's targeted malware, whether it is using commercial relationships with domestic providers, and then making sure that that ties in with the export control regime as well for domestically manufactured surveillance technology.
Maybe I want to raise another aspect which is also in the recommendations, is the proportionacy of things, necessary and proportionate. I think also on both sides, I think if you talk about transparency, it's about proportionality. It comes in, what do you want to survey, what's the problem, what are you aiming at, so to say. And the other thing, of course, if civil society or other people want to know certain things, why do you want to know it? I think there's a constant tension. The Secret Service people, they say, well, I'm not going to tell you how we do it, because then the bad guys will also know and they will outsmart us, which is in itself a very legitimate defense. But of course, if you're a civil society, you say, well, he's just saying that because he wants to hide something which is not okay. And then so you want to know more, so you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that's a sort of struggle which should be proportionate in a way too. Because if there's, like you were saying in the beginning, if there's trust, there's less need to dig deeper and deeper. The thing, of course, is that the trust has been broken in many ways. And I think this is, in every society is very different. And this is not something which is new to the digital age. To refer to my German colleague, when in the 70s and the 80s we had the Rote Armee-Fraktion, and the German government was digging very deep into the privacy of people to be able to catch these terrorists. They did that without many computers, etc. But it was such a traumatic experience for the German people, that they are much more sensitive to privacy protection than, for instance, the Dutch. The Dutch have an attitude, well, if you haven't done anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. So we trust the government, so let them do it. And I think this is something which is changing now, in which it's also important that if you set mechanisms in place, the government has to also take it into account that they can be wrong, and that they may have misused it. So another aspect for trust is the possibility of appeal. And that is something I think that needs to be looked into much more deeply now. And that's having to do also with how much do you want to know. Because as a perfectly innocent citizen, you could end up in certain listings without knowing. And you might go to the airport one day and try to enter a country, and all of a sudden a red light goes up and you're arrested. And you don't know why. If it was because you haven't paid your parking ticket, okay, it's acceptable. But it is something because you connected certain websites then and then, and you also used the word Al Qaeda twice in your mails, then you're in jail. So I'm exaggerating, of course, but that's something I think that is very important. And we've seen in the Dutch case of some cases of appeal for journalists who won. I think this is very important, that the government also has to see that they were wrong, and that they were, exposed to be wrong by court. And that's why this appeal mechanism, I think, is very crucial.
So, actually, the ambassador said a lot of what I was going to say, but I did want to link transparency also to remedy and accountability and notice after the fact. So Human Rights Watch has signed on to the necessary and proportionate principles, along with, I think, other people on this panel and about 400 other groups. I know one of the most controversial principles in that set of principles is the idea of notice, right? So giving notice to someone when they have been the target of surveillance. Now, I think there are legitimate needs for secrecy if there's an ongoing investigation and the like, but there's also a need for access to remedy. And if you never know that you were the subject of surveillance, then you can't actually seek remedy if you believe that that was an unjustified exercise of surveillance powers. And so I think that's a really important aspect, and it goes to both government action here, so governments being transparent after the fact if necessary, that someone has been the target of surveillance, but also companies. One of the reasons why we think companies should be able to notify users before or after handing over the information is that to the government, so that the user can actually then go to court to say, actually, I do think this order was illegal or unjustified. And so I think those are also aspects of the transparency issue that we shouldn't lose sight of.
If there are no other comments from the panel, I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions. Anyone have any particular questions on this much discussed topic, or are we all just waiting for the coffee break, which will start any moment now?
Just to follow on from some exchanges from yesterday about possibly benchmarking Freedom Online Coalition governments on the extent to which they've met their commitments, and particularly around the issues we've been discussing this morning. I'm wondering if any of the panels have some thoughts about sort of what's the best way to benchmark governments on their performance on these issues, and whether that's a good idea, and how we as a community should make that happen.
So I think it strikes me, I think, if there's a set of commitments and recommendations, the kind of logical next step is sort of implementation and, the degree to which that implementation is being successful. So I certainly think, from a GNI perspective, the idea of benchmarking the way in which the Freedom Online Coalition over time are implementing the recommendations is absolutely a critical next step. In terms of how to do that, I think there is certainly, specifically on sort of surveillance practices, there are some recommendations that GNI made in its recent submission to the UN High Commissioner report on privacy in the digital age. I won't list them all; it's publicly available, but we have some specific things in there around sort of ensuring laws authorising surveillance are sort of public, clear, specific, that legal interpretations are made public, and that there's sort of independent oversight mechanisms. So I think there are, from a GNI perspective, we've got some things that we've, as I say, suggested to the UN High Commissioner that we would like to see potentially developed as part of the benchmarking process.
Maybe I think if you talk about the Freedom Online Coalition members, during the conversation, much has also been said about where does it all lead to, and how there are 23 members now, and of course they are very different countries. And like speaking for the Dutch government, in many ways, I think we of course want to push the agenda as far as possible. And I think in that sense, the coalition has been very helpful. For instance, when we were at the ITU in Dubai, I think because the coalition could act as a coalition, maybe not all then 21 members were speaking out with the same intensity, but at least those who spoke out were able to voice on behalf of the 21 that we did manage to stop certain, certain decisions to be made, which would be very bad for the open and free internet. On the other hand, I think I don't want to put the Dutch government in a position that we are held accountable for the policy of any other Freedom Online Coalition member. And I think we should also avoid that we spend too much time sort of controlling each other. I think the good thing is, I think it's in a way, many ways it's up to the civil society in those countries concerned. Like if you're in Mexico, you can go to your government as a Mexican or an international NGO saying you've signed up for this, live up to it. And of course, we will do it also in the debates among governments, but I think the implementation, of course, is the key question. but governments have to implement themselves. And the Dutch government will not implement for the Mexican government. And I think but it's a good thing. I think if you look at it from the bright side, so to say, the fact that they've signed up to it is already important. And the same thing goes with, if you talk about the wider human rights context. When I visit countries of concern, as you may call them, and I talk to, like in Nigeria, where I've been, they tell me how perfect their legislation is. If you look at the legislation, they're right. It's all on paper, it's all there, but they don't implement. And then you get a totally different story why they are not able to implement. And then you can sort of, you're trying to focus on where can we, in a bilateral relation, be helpful, or where can we give best practices. But I think the fact that the coalition is there is something which should be taken as a sort of starting point and try to steer away from running around in the circle just in the coalition itself.
I seem to spend so much time at conferences apologising for the UK. I think it's absolutely right to benchmark. I think the challenge, as Lionel touched on earlier, is asking coalition member governments within the governments themselves to make sure that the Home, the State Department knows what the Foreign Affairs Department is saying so internationally, so that when something like Turkey happens, you don't start hearing, well, Britain is filtering, we're just doing what Britain's doing. And I think that's also part of the process going forward to benchmark, is making sure that domestic policies are developed with an awareness of what the coalition is saying internationally, so that you don't get this, irrelevant of what the coalition is saying, domestic policies are used to justify policies in other countries the coalition itself would not want to see.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, I would agree with my Dutch colleague that this is for the individual member states, but I did notice, and I think you made that point yesterday at the Big Tent meeting, some comments which were arguing the credibility of the Freedom Online Coalition has also to do with how the situation is in individual countries. So in this respect, I think that was also highlighted in the letter of 48 NGOs at the very end. I think there's some truth to that, but still I would agree this has to be what individual countries do in their own internal debate. You mentioned that there is a debate in some countries, and I would also want to recognize that there is actually a strong debate in the US, and you have a debate in Congress, you have a debate in civic society, you do have a debate by the companies, because let's be honest, for the companies it's a very important point also for their business. So you do have that debate, and I think the speech of Secretary of State Kerry yesterday did recognize that debate, and also recognize the bilateral angle of that debate. And we are going to have a bilateral dialogue on cyber issues with our US colleagues, including the multi-stakeholder element at the end of June. And last not least, somebody mentioned the UN High Commissioner. I just wanted to say that she is about to draft the report which was commissioned by the UN resolution, so we're waiting to see that report by the summer, and that will take us into a next debate on the issue in the UN General Assembly. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
Hi, it's a really interesting debate, thanks. One of the questions that I would have and I don't think is referred to in the recommendations and principles, is the situation regarding whistleblowers themselves. There's all this discussion about what's happened since Edward Snowden made these disclosures, and yet we still have him being seen as a criminal and a traitor within the US. EU countries refusing to take him in, but being happy to talk to him on video links if he wants to give sort of evidence to the European Parliament, etc. There's so many ironies at play here. If everyone now accepts that these were absolutely critical disclosures, then should we not be also requiring countries to formulate some sort of general agreement on how whistleblowers are supported and protected?
maybe not a very serious answer, but I always, when I go, for instance, when we talk to China, we have always a big row on individual cases. We want to raise individual cases with the Chinese. And once when I had an informal meeting with them, I said, well, why don't you come up with the same thing? Because they say, well, it's not in our culture to counter your individual cases with individual cases. But I was always thinking, well, if they would do so, I think Snowden would be on the top of the list. And I think that they would be, in many ways, rightfully doing that. But luckily they didn't.
I think your question is very valid, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like all governments want to admit the importance of those revelations, right? I think that is the big irony, despite the fact that most of these conversations we are having do come out of that.
All right, other questions from the audience? And if not, so one thing I wanted to get some perspectives on is, so Cynthia mentioned the necessary and proportionate principles, which are based on international human rights standards and trying to pull from international human rights law, 13 principles that should govern and constrain state surveillance. And so, of course, these kinds of principles have to be based on international norms around human rights. But what we've also heard from a number of the panelists is that the situation in each country is very particular, and it's very much based around issues of national security, national sovereignty, particular histories with relation to these questions. So, sort of open-ended question, but I'd love thoughts from the panelists on how can particularly global civil society or civil society from other countries best weigh in and contribute to particular national reform efforts. It seems like there are really key distinctions and elements for local context that maybe aren't as immediately apparent when you're an organization that's operating not in that context.
So just a thought from a GNI perspective. So GNI is one of a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives in different industries looking at the sort of intersection between business and human rights. We have an accountability mechanism to hold the companies who are members of GNI accountable in the way that other organizations like GNI do in other industries, like, for example, the Fair Labour Association in apparel. I think one of the things that's different about GNI is that from the beginning, the sort of intention and the thought behind GNI was that there would be a component to our work which was direct policy and advocacy, particularly around sort of reform of laws and regulations in countries, precisely because it's governments who set the context within which companies operate. So I think, from our perspective, we hope that by bringing companies together with human rights groups, investors and academics and engaging directly on policy and advocacy work, that's one way in which we can potentially affect change. And I think, part of the thinking behind that is that there's sort of strength in numbers. It's easier and potentially more effective to have that conversation with governments if there's a wider group of stakeholders standing together than, potentially perhaps individual companies trying to do it on their own.
I'm not sure though how much space we need to give to the national context. And I was thinking this also as the two government representatives were responding to Rebecca's question. I think it should be perfectly possible to develop fairly general benchmarks that would affect all governments, I would presume. And I'm thinking, for example, of that Sweden has now announced that even the figures that they earlier did not want to release on government surveillance because of national security reasons, that they are now trying to find a way to represent this publicly. And they have certain concerns about how to do that exactly, because there is content of that information that they don't want to become public, but they still want to start sharing all the numbers. I think every time a government takes a step like that, they set a new benchmark. If Sweden is going to do that, And if Sweden can do that, then clearly every government can do that. And I think it's really important for civil society to kind of start to continue to push on these things. And because it's actually setting a new norm. Every time a government takes a positive step forward like that, they've set a new norm. And if one government can do it, I think we should use that in other contexts as an example every time that it is possible, and break some of these narratives about national security in particular in that way.
I'll just briefly comment on that. I mean, some of this is a very common international advocacy problem, right? You have to articulate at a certain level of abstraction universal norms as best you can, and then work within each individual country to develop that, and knowing the country, knowing its culture. At the risk of making too awkward a segue, I think it's also similar to transparency reports, right? The transparency reports that come out are different in their style and their substance to a degree, and that's, I think, fine. Like, every company has its own culture, just like every government has its own culture. And you know, the challenge is hitting the right level of abstraction for universality, right? And that's always the challenge in any context like this.
Did you have a...
Thank you. My name is Patrik Iselius. I'm representing Telia Sonera, Telco, and the Industry Dialogue 9 companies. As Telia Sonera, we welcome, of course, very much the move by, as mentioned by Anja, by the Swedish government on transparency. I also want to thank Susan for your work with the letters to the Freedom Line Coalition member states, and was wondering if you could say something on what will happen next on that work and how that will be further presented by the GNI. Thank you.
So we're still working that out, to be blunt. I think we've had responses, as I say, from about half of the governments in the Freedom Online Coalition. So I think an immediate next step is follow up to try and have responses from the governments that we haven't yet heard from. And then I think a sort of logical next step would be to try and find a way of engaging with the Freedom Online Coalition on the responses that we've received, and to sort of look at how it connects into the recommendations that were adopted yesterday. But that's, we're still sort of working out exactly how we might do that.
Any final questions from the audience? Okay. Great. Then I would like to give each of the panelists a chance for any closing comments you have, either on, as Susan was just telling us about, next steps, next plans you have for the issue of transparency or broader accountability and surveillance reform, or to identify any particular gaps. What's standing in your way from accomplishing whatever it is you'd like to see next? We'll start at one. Nick's got a long list, so maybe start with him.
It's a very, very long list. I think the best thing we can ask for is an informed public who can then hold lawmakers to account for remarks. And I think one of the big problems we do have to overcome is this: we can't confirm or deny for national security reasons. So it got to a ridiculous situation where myself and a British parliamentarian had to go to Washington in January to find out what was going on in the UK, and then give evidence to the British Parliament to say what was going on in the US, because that was more information than they could get from the British agencies. Now, the absurdity of that situation was not lost on us as we were giving evidence and being asked by people. But actually, one of the things I think that can be done, and the Freedom Online Coalition is a very good network to do this, is to share both the big picture, but also the small practical steps. So little things like members of Congress having security clearance by virtue of being elected members of Congress versus British parliamentarians who don't. Now, when we told the British parliamentarians this, they were quite upset. But actually, comparing and contrasting small technical changes that can have big cultural impacts on secrecy, on transparency, and on accountability, I think is very important. And then making sure that, as you say, to keep it away from abstraction and to make it accessible to everyday citizens. I think that's the one thing that I think is really, really important, is it's very easy to have a very abstract global debate when we need to remember this is about men, women and children going about their everyday lives without the fear of being surveyed by governments, whether the law is there or not. So to keep it to a human level rather than just an abstract level is, I think, the most important thing for me going forward.
I think in India, the big challenge is still just to get larger audiences to realize that surveillance is an issue and that it is something that creates problems. So just the impact of, say, surveillance of metadata is really unclear for many people, even to journalists, for example. The debate on this is at a very basic level, so I think where we need to start is really at that place.
So I have sort of two different directions over the next few months. I think the first one is the advocacy fight for surveillance reform in the United States has not even reached its apex yet. There's still a lot of work left to be done. Even where we get to the point where the USA Freedom Act gets passed in something like its current form, like that would get us a long way there. But we still would have more work to do just on pushing for legal reforms in the space. But one of the big things that I'm going to be thinking more about is this space of targeted surveillance threats and how to understand this better, and to sort of try to map out the landscape of different technical threats that are posed by some of these aggressive surveillance practices, to get a better handle on how law can respond to them, how technology might be able to respond to them, and to try to build some inertia on the side of building more secure technologies to the extent that that can be done. It's another sort of, I think, understated role that companies can play. I mean, we've seen a little bit of this with better secure traffic between data centers and so forth, but there's a lot more to be done in the next 12 months in that direction as well.
So I'm just going to highlight a big challenge we're facing, and I'm not sure what the answer is. But I think what the revelations really brought into stark relief is that modern digital surveillance can now take place at great distances, right? And so in that context, you have a handful of governments who have the technical capability of surveilling or collecting data about millions, if not billions, of people around the world. But the political challenge that we have, especially in the US, which is what I'm most familiar with, is that elected officials, they don't really have the incentive to do anything to protect rights of people outside their country, because they don't vote, right? They're not part of the elections. They don't vote for those policymakers. And so the amount of political will for real reform in this area, I think, is going to be a big uphill battle, as Chris says. I guess one way that we can try to address this is to make sure that these issues stay on the agenda of the international human rights institutions. So whether it's the Human Rights Council or the regional human rights bodies and that kind of thing, because I think those diplomatic pressures and government kind of dialogue and raising these issues, governments raising on behalf of their own citizens with governments who are conducting mass surveillance, is one way that we can kind of get at that political will issue.
So I think I'm just going to echo Anya's and Cynthia's comments. It strikes me that we're at the very beginning and very early stages of what is going to be a very long debate and discussion. And I think in terms of sort of what's missing, and one of the thorniest problems, it seems to me, the rights of non-citizens, so that when surveillance happens on people who are not citizens of that country, I think we're barely at the beginning stages of that, and that's clearly going to be incredibly important.
Thank you. Maybe to take it more general, in the sense that I think you have this distinction between what we're now focusing on, very sophisticated surveillance. I think the basic principle should be human rights in general. Not try to invent new things, but try to see where, with the good old human rights, you can set standards. And also, I think within the coalition, also like specifically, sophisticated governments should work on their credibility by, say, offering more transparency, more accountability, etc. But on the other hand, and I think that's something that's also the Freedom Online Coalition is doing, we should not forget the primitive countries. Like during this conference, we've heard that 9 Ethiopian bloggers have been put in jail. These things are happening every day around the world. I think these people are very sophisticated. They simply, you could call it targeted or whatever you like, but they are very primitive in a way and very direct in it. They follow their own citizens, not to monitor for any serious threats, but to get them in jail because they are opposition to their government. I think these are very basic, primitive human rights violations that we should not forget talking about these more sophisticated issues. And I think the Digital Defender Fund of the Freedom Online Coalition is a very important instrument in that sense.
Thank you very much. And I would also want to highlight the point on the rights of foreigners. One thing which puzzled Germans a little bit was that in the beginning, the US debate was only on constitutional rights of American citizens. But I mean, I can understand that an American lawmaker would look at that in particular because that is his constitution. But in the speech of President Obama, that point at least was publicly recognized, and I believe more work has to be done on that front, but he did recognize that in his speech, and that was the first time we had seen it spelled out in such a clear way. I don't know the details yet, but there has been a court ruling yesterday for Microsoft, I believe it was, that they would have to, by a federal court, that they would have to reach out or hand out data wherever they are. That could create certain problems. The other point I would like to make is parliamentary oversight. That was one of the main points of our internal debate post-Snowden. And so for the services, the other point there is for internet in general. So for the first time ever, we have an internet committee in our parliament, but I have to admit, this is a body which right now can discuss things, but they can't take decisions yet. So the old boys are still making sure, the Interior Committee and the classic ones are still having the last say when it comes to decisions, but we now have an internet committee, and I think they will make their inroads. And last not least, to also reflect the encryption point, which I think in the German debate has become very central. We believe that there is something we can do where we have a certain strength. So it's part of that debate, which some people call the technical sovereignty. But it's also very important when it comes to the issue of regaining trust in the system. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and expertise with us this morning. Thank you all for sticking it out through the whole panel on day 2 of the conference. And with that, I see by our blinking light that we're out of time. So I hope you all go enjoy the coffee break.
Thank you.